and moist, and it was black and moist, and it was black and moist, black and moist. But I'm embarrassed to tell you that it was 50 years later that I understood why it was black. That's the carbon.
Since Earth's soil holds 4 times the carbon as all living plants and animals combined, Gore's Farm east of Nashville is a working, growing laboratory to figure out the best way to keep it out of the sky and in the ground. There's a perception out there that this kind of farming is for the Amish or for hippies or for small elites who can afford organic produce. Does this scale?
Yeah, I think it does. You used to hear that same argument applied to solar panels, where they say, oh, yeah, if, the wealthy elites can install solar panels. But look at what's happening now in subdivisions and places all over the country. People are putting in the solar panels because they're getting cheaper electricity. I think the same thing's going to happen with regenerative agriculture.
I came across a startling fact recently that humanity has burned more carbon since your first book came out than in all of human history before that.
Yeah.
We're still going completely in the
You're
wrong
not implying
direction.
a cause and effect there.
No, I'm just saying,
I know
despite your best efforts, we live both globally and locally in a perpetual growth idea. And you don't get elected and you don't get a board seat these days by saying, you know what, we should slow down.
We're in, as they say, a mill of a hess. We've really got a big challenge on our hands, the biggest challenge human civilization's ever faced, really.
But the former vice does not agree that humanity must first process through the 5 stages of grief.
We have not been condemned to a death sentence. There is a group of people that seem to be eager to go from denial to despair without pausing on the intermediate step of solving the damn problem and doing the things that we can do now. And the good news is the solutions are not utopian. They are available.
But even with all the technology, even with plenty of will,
I can at least say I tried to do something.
and a whole lot of faith, so much of this story comes down to politics. Coming up,
there is no man-made climate change.
it's a dive into partisan division, fueled by fossil fuel. But first, a trip to fire country, where they're learning now more than ever.
Only you can prevent forest fires.
Smokey Bear is wrong.
Smokey the Bear, prowling and a growling and a sniffing the air. He can find a fire before it starts to flame. That's why they call him Smokey. That was how he got his name.
Bless his cartoon heart. But for nearly 75 years, our friend Smokey Bear has been mostly wrong.
So remember, only you can prevent forest fires.
No, you can't. Sure, the vast majority of forest fires are human-caused, but the fires set by lightning often burn more acres than the ones set by people. In fact, some of the recent epic blazes in Australia were so big, their smoke columns created lightning, which started more fires. And as the American West warmed 59% faster than the rest of the planet since 1970, more drought and more infestation of tree-killing beetles turned forests into fuel. Just as millions of people with their campfires, cigarettes, and power lines came searching for paradise.
That's how hot things got. That's a water meter.
Yeah, and just melted it.
Yeah.
And then when the system depressurized, it sucked in all that toxic
That's
smoke.
the belief.
Around the time the campfire ripped through paradise, the deadliest in California history, the 4th National Climate Assessment predicted that by 2050, the size of Western wildfires could increase 2 to 6 times. And that's sobering, because Paradise is a case study that when the smoke clears, the nightmare has only just begun. And in the meantime, you can't drink the water.
Can't drink the water.
And after wildfires ripped from wine country in the north to the mansions of Malibu in the south, an industry analysis found that insurance companies paid out twice as much in 2 years than they took in profit over 26. Twice as much in two. An industry analysis found that insurance companies paid out twice as much in 2 years than they took in profit over 26. Air has only just begun. And in the meantime, you can't drink the water.
Can't drink the water.
And after wildfires ripped from wine country in the north to the mansions of Malibu in the south, an industry analysis found that insurance companies paid out twice as much in 2 years than they took in profit over 26.
And I'll guarantee you, many of those people up there are grossly uninsured or maybe even underinsured, because the insurance services offices have really cracked down. If you're in a fire-prone area, they are doubling, tripling your insurance costs or canceling you.
This is my old college apartment in Malibu. I couldn't afford insurance back in the day. I can only hope that whoever lived here during the Woolsey fire was covered. You have a list of addresses that are covered by your company.
We do.
And since public first responders have been so strapped, private, for-profit firefighting companies are booming. The kind used by Kim Kardashian and Kanye West to protect their Calabasas mansion in the same blaze that took my college apartment.
Have you ever come across a house that's engulfed and is nowhere near one of your houses and you just have to drive on by?
Yes and no. I've also done some pro bono work too, because had we not done anything about it, that house would have been gone.
When America was new, firefighting was a private enterprise. It was Ben Franklin who created the first bucket brigades and sold the idea that if everyone helps put out the poor neighbor's house, the community saves itself.
I want to stop right there. The community does save itself if everybody pulls together and develops a program that everybody can live with. But whenever you have these escalating prices of how much it costs to build a home today in comparison to 10 years ago, plus whenever you're being penalized by the insurance companies that you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, it becomes almost impossible for some of these people to rebuild their lives or to rebuild their communities back. And it's not just the heavily forest areas out west, but it's also the coasting lining areas that if you're within like 25 miles of the water's edge of the coast, it don't matter if it's the East Coast or the South Coast, depending upon what insurance company that you have, you may be, and depending upon what state that you're at, you may be prone of paying 2 to 3 times more for your house insurance than your citizen that lives in the same state up the road 75 to 100 miles further away from the water's edge than you do. So it's in conjunction with everything. It's not only the 2x4s that has now reached a limit of treated 2x4s for $20 for 10 foot, which is basically $2 a foot. I don't know. I think I've been told that the lumber has went down just a little bit. But it's also based around you being penalized pertaining to the insurance company that you're insured with, depending upon where you live. And it's not just the forestry, heavily forest division, that these oxymorons are happening in regards towards the industry cutting off its own nose to despite its face. It's really, really sad whenever we have gotten this disproportionalized to the point that the system is no longer functioning in the well-being or the benefit of the people.
Do you think with the fires getting as bad as they are, the trends, we could be going back to that model? Where
maybe
you guys could do to fire departments with
Hey,
Uber
you don't want to
drivers
sit
and
down.
taxi drivers? Like I
Quit
I
acting
call you
crazy.
to come put out my house?
Go sit
and
down.
pay you?
I think, yes, I do think it's going to possibly go that way. And, you know, people will say, well, we cater to the rich. We don't. As you see, the resources are so thin, they're so spread out. We've got these fires just going crazy. You know, I mean, would you do it?
Yeah, absolutely. To protect my family, sure. Do you imagine a future where it's the haves and the have-nots when it comes to defending your house against a wildfire?
Yeah, I'm not going to imagine that future because I'm hired to manifest a different future. You guys all going to do something about it?
Gavin Newsom ran on promises to move California into a carbon-free future. But as governor, he has been consumed by fire and all its complications. Like PG&E, the state's largest utility company, blamed for a series of blazes with liability lawsuits pushing them into bankruptcy. Like the families burned into homelessness in the middle of a housing crisis. And towns like Paradise, struggling to rebuild.
It should not be a state of haves and have-nots that can protect themselves. It's incumbent upon elected officials of all political stripes to protect the most vulnerable, and we're prioritizing the most vulnerable.
But just put it in dollar figures. How much does the campfire cost just to fight, just to put out the flames?
It is jaw-dropping, the numbers, and they continue to escalate. Just the debris removal is in the multi-billion dollar expense.
Since the campfire started on federal land, some argue for more logging there to thin fuel.
That's the direction the fire spread.
But naturalists point out life as we know it now calls for more forests, not less.
And we have to also be willing to be skeptical about agencies and companies that are in the logging business that say they're going to somehow save towns from fire by doing a bunch of logging deep out in the forest. Because that's exactly what they did here. And we saw the tragic consequences of that in the campfire.
Yes, a decade before the deadliest blaze in state history, another fire burned the ridges above Paradise. The timber companies logged this whole area and put in a plantation of ponderosa pines, all with the argument that by managing the forest, man can prevent the next big fire. Exactly the opposite happened. When the campfire came roaring over that ridge, it blasted through this logged area at a rate 3 times faster than average. By some estimates, if they had let this go wild and not touched it, the people in Paradise would have had 2 extra hours to evacuate.
A tree that falls in the first few years is indeed a problem from a fuels perspective. But a tree that's been, that fell 5, 10, 15 years acts more as a sponge.
New science and ancient wisdom are helping more folks understand that Western landscapes evolved to burn. They need fire to thrive.
There's a bunch of native insects that actually depend on dead trees.
The bugs attract the woodpeckers, which make burrows for the bluebirds, and flying squirrels, which attract the hawks, and so on through the web of life. All the way up to bears.
But you can't have any of that unless you have fire or drought that kills patches of trees.
A forest needs death to live.
Exactly. Natural regeneration.
But now more than ever, ecologists like Chad would try to convince our old friend to modify his message. Only you can prevent community fires. Instead of battling blazes deep in unpopulated woods, he says let them burn and spend those resources defending homes and businesses in towns like Paradise.
If folks think climate change is not real, if folks think, well, we can't afford to address climate change, my gosh, jaw-dropping to me, the naivete of that, because the most expensive option is doing nothing.
Plenty will stay, rebuild, fight, and adapt. But where do the folks smoked out of California or flooded out of Louisiana go? If my land goes underwater, is it still my land?
Generally not.
How hard is it to move entire towns?
Anybody else is probably not moving.
Next stop, a look at the next great migration. about the size of a football field, slides into the sea. Stop on the road to change, Louisiana. Named after a French king and sold to us for less than 3 cents an acre. Good deal. But now this land is sinking, just as seas are rising. Every hour of every day, a piece of Louisiana about the size of a football field slides into the sea.
For people who study sea level change like me, there has been a lot of change in just the last, say, 5 years.
And those who study the drowning of Louisiana say it's happening faster than anyone ever predicted.
What maybe 5 years ago was the worst case scenario is now what we might call a fairly likely scenario.
That's terrifying.
It is terrifying. And it basically means climate change is here in full force.
Do you have children?
I have an 8-year-old daughter.
You think she will ever be able to, say, take out a 30-year mortgage in New Orleans?
I don't know. That is, I wouldn't bet my money on it, let's put it that way.
This is for a regular high tide. There's no bad weather event. This is just water coming in.
Woke up to this. Dalton and Mom. Saturday, 10 a.m. by Mama's. 2 hours south of New Orleans is Ile de Jean-Charles, settled when a band of Biloxi, Chitimacha, Choctaw needed a place to hide from the Trail of Tears.
See these 2 trees right here?
For the first 100 years, they farmed this land until the saltwater came.
Whenever the water would get like this, you'd feel water right underneath the floor of the house.
They raised their homes a few feet, and then a few feet more, until before and after satellite proved what they already knew. 98% of their homeland has disappeared.
I always talk about water as our life and our death. If we weren't able to farm anymore, the waters, the shrimp, the oysters, the crabs that sustain our people, now is killing us. It's killing us.
So Ile de Jean-Charles won a first-of-its-kind grant, $48 million federal dollars, to move 40 miles north. The state bought 500 acres of old sugarcane fields.
We're going to have baseball fields, fishing ponds, wetlands, homes along the back.
But before they could even break ground,
We just had a tribal meeting today.
they're getting a harsh lesson in just how hard it is to convince Americans to uproot and retreat.
Anybody else is probably not moving.
Really?
So, yeah.
Half of the 30 families who live here say they'll never leave. Some worry that if they can't pick their own land and neighbors, they'll lose tribal identity.
We can't discriminate against people. There is a Fair Housing Act that says you can't tell people they can or can't live here based on some characteristic that they have.
Others like Chris have a hard time believing that glaciers melting so far away could ever take his land.
I have trouble with that.
So do you doubt that melting glaciers in Antarctica are going to affect you here?
Yes.
You doubt that?
Yes, because this place has always been surrounded by water. You know, we've always been around water. And so if we would be sinking, I think we would be sunk.
If my land goes underwater due to sea level rise, is it still my land?
Generally not.
Really?
Generally, when land turns into open, navigable water, the public owns it, and you don't get a check.
It's not underwater.
But eventually it will be, right?
It's not there yet.
All right.
And I heard that, but it's still on top.
It's still dry, and it's still yours.
And it's still mine.
If it is this hard to move a few dozen people, consider the most widely accepted estimate that by mid-century, climate could displace 200 million. At least 130,000 Puerto Ricans left their island right after Hurricane Maria. For many of the folks I met there, after losing home and hope,
Utter devastation.
their American passport became their most valuable possession. And they are lucky compared to members of the migrant caravans in recent years. Among them, Central American farmers whose crops had failed in freak weather. So imagine what border crossings around the world might look like as things get worse. In the U.S., imagine another great migration as folks seek safe harbor or fresh starts like Okies who fled the Dust Bowl during the Depression. Such mass movement could eventually shift the entire electoral map, turning red states blue, blue states red, and it'll change our very definition of neighbor and stranger. So now might be a good time to better understand the human dynamic between those who believe the crisis is real and those who don't.
You only have 11 years to live, folks. 11 years, because climate change is just coming up on us so fast.
Next up, a journey into the hows,
climate gate,
and whys of denial.
There were death threats made to me and to my family.
This little
That's what happens whenever you try to help people. They turn on you like a vicious animal.
The most zealous believers in the warnings from science.
Sad.
For the last couple years, I have been pinballing between two Americas. The one that believes we are committing fossil fuel suicide, and the one that does not.
I've heard this thing about, the climate's changing, the climate's changing, and I've yet to really see any substantial proof of it.
You'd think that victims of record-shattering fires or drowning towns would be the most zealous believers in the warnings from science. But human nature doesn't work that way.
If I were to say that I was affected by the climate change taking place where the icebergs are melting and it's turning into water, I have trouble with that.
And sometimes...
So this is it?
Yeah, this is it.
Members of the two Americas share the same name, blood, and home.
You guys built this all yourselves?
Yes, we just team effort.
One boatload at a time.
One boatload at a time.
Oh, wow, this is cozy.
For generations, the Whitney family has been watching their beloved bayous in southern Louisiana disappear.
When you think about how much land we've lost just in our lifetime, it's pretty scary. There's nothing building it back up.
But even though they were nurtured in the same nature, the brothers don't see eye to eye on why.
Do I sense a little bit of brotherly disagreement on whether man-made global warming is real?
I do believe.
You believe and you don't?
I'm not a big believer in it.
Really? Why?
I guess I go from what I see. Right now, most of the United States is clenched in ice. Niagara Falls is frozen over. I just don't see where the warming effect is.
Have you tried to explain to them that climate change doesn't necessarily mean we're all going to turn into the tropics?
We have just decided to agree to disagree.
Oh, really? Okay.
Personally, I think the science seems to be pretty spot on that.
We can hope your brother's right.
That's right.
Well, as just like we need to be stewards of our land and our marsh and try to preserve it, I mean, we need to be conscious of what we're doing to the environment. We do need to be stewards of everything that we do on Earth.
I could see him going out of his way to say, just because I don't believe in climate change doesn't mean I'm not interested in being a steward of the land.
Right.
And that just felt very poignant.
My grandfather originally had the property out here.
When I discussed the Whitney brothers with climate psychologist Renee Lertzman, she urged me to consider the setting. This is oil country, where loyalty to neighbors and respect for tradition is just as important as being a good steward of the land.
The oil companies own the property mostly for the mineral rights, but they've been very generous to allow people to lease surface rights.
In my experience, when people have a hard time coming to terms with the reality that climate change is actually human created, that usually there's something going on that we're trying to protect. And it could be our deeply held loyalties to family, to industry.
Or for some folks,
we keep hearing that 2014 has been the warmest year on record.
Loyalty to a certain brand of politics.
You know what this is? It's a snowball.
I would not call it the greatest crisis, no, sir.
Whether it gets hotter or colder, the climate's always changing.
There is no man-made climate change.
Is anything we do now going to make any significant difference? No, I am a denier.
Something's changing and it'll change back again. I don't think it's a hoax. I think there's probably a difference, but I don't know that it's man-made.
These days, it's hard to imagine the words conservative and conservation together, even though they're just two letters apart.
We come to Rio with more scientific knowledge about the environment than ever before.
But not that long ago, they were.
We come to Rio with an action plan on climate change.
In '92, the first President Bush signed the first UN Climate Accord. A decade earlier, Exxon's own scientists explained the greenhouse effect to their bosses and predicted with eerie precision just how hot we would get. So while today Exxon insists that its understanding of climate change has tracked the scientific consensus, internal Exxon documents show that they knew in '82. But what did they do? Drill, baby, drill. And spin, baby, spin. By '88, they were officially emphasizing the uncertainty.
Proponents of the global warming theory say that burning fossil fuels is the reason. The scientific evidence remains inconclusive as to whether human activities affect the global climate.
And then in 2009, just as the world was poised to take real action at a summit in Copenhagen,
the hacked email controversy involving British scientists.
It's been dubbed ClimateGate. Emails that many say cast doubt on the entire science behind global warming claims.
Someone hacked into a server at a university in England and stole over 1,000 emails between climate scientists.
I remember when I first learned of this, it was just before Thanksgiving in 2009.
Among the scientists whose emails were hacked, Penn State's Michael Mann, co-author of the famous hockey stick graph, showing how Earth's temperature had jumped in the 20th century. Findings that have since been confirmed by the National Academy of Sciences.
They went through these stolen emails and cherry-picked individual phrases.
By suggesting that scientists were making it all up, so-called ClimateGate hijacked the conversation at the worst possible time.
There were actionable death threats made to me and to my family.
Multiple investigations from the EPA to the UK's House of Commons cleared them and declared ClimateGate was a malevolent hoax.
The only wrongdoing was the theft, the criminal theft of the emails in the first place.
But it only added more fossil fuel to the machinery of denial.
In the last 15 years, there has been no recorded warming.
So, Mr. President, catch this.
If we're all products of the stories we hear from the people we trust, it's no wonder that Republican Mike and Democrat Keith can look at the same disappearing land and disagree.
You have a lot of good-hearted people who have been convinced by their tribe, if they're loyal Republicans, that they are supposed to deny the science of climate change.
That may be changing. CPAC, is an annual gathering for the reddest of red-blooded Republicans.
So you believe that climate change, the climate crisis, is a hustle?
In ways, yes, absolutely. But this year, 2 booths away from Climate Hustle 2 starring Kevin Sorbo, I met Kiara O'Brien.
I've been to a few CPACs in my day, and spotting a climate woke Republican who wants to have a carbon tax is like spotting a snow leopard in the wild. I mean, this is... So do you consider yourself sort of a Republican Greta?
No. I see myself as a solution seeker. We've talked about the problem, we recognize the problem, and now we need to talk about solutions.
She is a big fan of the Baker-Schultz plan, named after Ronald Reagan's cabinet members who helped write it. It would tax carbon emissions and then divvy it up among Americans. The average family would get $2,000 a year to start, but both tax and dividends would ramp up until fossil fuels go the way of the dinosaurs.
This is the solution that is backed by the largest statement of economists in the history of the profession of economics.
No doubt, political winds are shifting with the changes in the weather.
There is nothing we can do to stop whatever the weather is going to do. We can't make it warmer, we can't make it colder.
But could they blow open a new age of will and innovation?
What do we want? Climate justice!
You can't just sit around waiting for hope to come.
The people, united, will never be divided.
Next up on our journey, the search for hope.
The people, united, will never be divided. The people, united, will never be divided.
Georgia's runoff.
I'm David Culver, and
in ways subtle and staggering. This trip shows how the climate crisis is already affecting countless lives. But the best science warns that this journey into change has only just begun. Since the Industrial Revolution began, Earth has warmed about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. The Paris Accord set the ambitious limit of 2.7 degrees, but it is getting hotter faster. To hold that limit, scientists of the IPCC say we may only have about 500 gigatons of carbon left to burn. Period. But Bernstein research found there are 2,900 gigatons already on the books of fossil fuel corporations, and burning it all would blow past 5.4 degrees Fahrenheit, a road to hell. All within the lifetime of this little guy, William River Weir, my unborn son.
I know what you're thinking. What's your carbon footprint, Weir? How much do you burn making shows like this? Well, last year, just in commercial air travel, it was about 110 tons.
It's impossible to rent an electric vehicle big enough to hold my crew and gear. Or at least a decade away from carbon-free jumbo jets. So the best I can do is eat less meat, take more trains, and buy enough carbon offsets to plant 2,423 urban trees. But that's not a fix. But at least it's something. Which is why Al Gore says he triple offsets all the carbon he burns. Do you think it's important individually to show that sort of commitment in order for your message to be taken seriously?
Yeah, I do, and I do that. But at the same time, as important as it is to change your light bulbs, it is way more important to change the nation's policies.
A recent study found that since the 80s, just 100 companies profited from 71% of industrial earth-warming pollution. And much the way big bottling and packaging companies used a fake crying Indian to shift the blame for pollution onto the consumer in the 70s,
People start pollution. People can stop it.
it is now in the best interest of fossil fuel companies to blame the individual for global warming. Instead of a crying Indian, they use windmills to show that you can still feel good about their product because they're working on a carbon-free future. But Exxon's own annual reports show that the amount they actually invest in lower emission energy solutions is less than 2% of what they spent last year drilling for oil and gas. You have taken a stance that you won't fly at all. You think it's okay if I do?
I mean, I'm not telling anyone else what to do or what not to do. So, of course, why would I care about your flights? I am only doing this because I have decided that I myself want to live this way. You can do whatever you want, of course.
Flight shaming helps distract us from the government prediction that the two fastest growing jobs in America this decade will be solar and wind installers. There are dozens of other green energy ideas just waiting to be scaled up. But to build them fast enough, the country must pull together in a way that it hasn't since World War II. And get the rest of the world to join us. You're proposing essentially the moonshot, the original New Deal, the civil rights movement, all of that together. The Sunrise Movement helped push the Green New Deal. A grand resolution to tackle the climate crisis and reshape society and the economy at the same time.
Young people want to be talking about jobs and the economy and the climate crisis and racial inequity and how we get access to health insurance and health care.
As part of the same conversation.
Yes, honestly, it's very difficult to pull them apart.
The Green New Deal is vague and controversial, but it is only the first stab at legislating the end of life as we know it. And whether it is this idea or some other, a Harvard study examined hundreds of protest movements through history and found that if a nonviolent campaign can attract only 3.5% of a nation's population, change is almost guaranteed, which means less than 12 million Americans could force a tipping point if they can manage to turn eco-anxiety and depression into action.
You can't just sit around waiting for hope to come. Then you're acting like spoiled, irresponsible children. You don't seem to understand that hope is something you have to earn.
You probably can't take a sailboat to scold world leaders like Greta, but you can earn your hope. You can get in the face of your local officials and your favorite brands. You can pester your bank and grocer and utility company for their zero carbon plans. And since a Yale study found that about 65% of people talk about the climate crisis rarely or never, you can connect with neighbors, give voice to your worries and theirs, and maybe give Mother Nature some love while you're at it.
One of the most powerful things we can be doing is to talk about it and to name it. If we can pause and ask more questions and show curiosity, what are you really afraid of? What are you really anxious about? And allow that to just have space. Then we would find so many more people tracking along with us.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
They say there's only three kinds of stories in the world. Man versus nature, man versus man, and man versus himself. But what if we tried more man with nature stories? Man with man. Man at peace with himself. It may just change the script and save life as we know it. Hey, buddy,
Can't wait to meet you.
Amen. You know, as technology has grown, the world, by and large, has shrunk. As the world has shrunk, so has our denial towards not wanting to believe that 7.8 billion humans on the planet is having this type of effect upon to the planet. You don't have to be an Einstein to understand the artificial heat that comes from a motor, not just a motor on a car, but a motor on a refrigerator, a motor on an ice box, or a washing machine. The lights that you turn on, it's artificial heat that's being generated from that light bulb. Even the lights on your automobile at night will still generate a certain amount of heat. Every bearing that rolls down the road pertaining to an axle moving it in some form or fashion creates heat because it creates static. Static is what creates heat. I just know that since my lifetime of moving to Northwest Tennessee, whenever we first got here, the winters wasn't as harsh as the winters in Chicago, but they was still extremely harsh. We raised pigs, cows, other types of livestock, that it was nothing unusual to have to go out and break the ice sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, usually twice, once in the morning, once in the afternoon. That way your livestock would have adequate water to drink. We didn't have fancy heating systems that could prevent a certain part of the pond of it not freezing like they do today. We basically had to do things the good old-fashioned manual way. And it wasn't nothing unusual for the ground to get frozen along about mid to latter part of November. That stayed that way, give or take, until long about March or April of the following next year. I'm going to say since 1983, whenever a miraculous miracle took place in my life is whenever I started noticing how profound difference in our weather patterns, to the point that we was no longer having long, cold, hard winters. Now, there's no doubt sometimes it's liable to get 10 degrees here. But the thing about it is, it don't get 10 degrees and stay 10 degrees. It only stays 10 degrees for a night or two, if that, and then it starts moving right back up again. In other words, if we was to get 8 to 18-inch snow here in Tennessee, it would be no way that it would only last maybe 3 or 4 days. Probably at the very most a week, and then it would be back to freezing again. So there is no doubt that we are affecting this planet Earth in ways that 50 years ago would have been unimaginable. But now we're seeing it right in front of our very eyes, unless you are a denier such as Donald J. Trump and others up onto the planet. The Bible even talks about those who are destroying the world, how that God will return to destroy those who are steadily destroying the earth. Because as we're destroying our earth, we're actually bringing more grief and more hardship upon to ourselves. Because if we cannot control the atmosphere within our own lives, how can we expect for other countries and nations to control theirs? I appreciate you taking time in listening to this and watching part of this, I wish that it talked more on other deeper subjects pertaining to the plastic, of how corrupted it's destroying our ecosystem in all our seas and our oceans, plus the sunlight that's generated down onto the plastic that bounces off the frequency of the water, generates that much more heat that is warming our oceans that much more. Plus, I believe that the oils that we're draining from the earth is allowing for the core to accelerate more so than ever, to the point that now we're seeing and feeling the effects of global warming. Please, we must all do our part in making sure that you're not driving a vehicle that you really have no business driving, pertaining to going up and down the roads, wasting fuel, precious fuel, and poisoning our air that much further. We're also enlightened to see the things that has been discovered during a very, very close era of 2012 leading into 2013. We know that it's by the Native American spirit that has identified this type of problem that is going on, not just here in America, but throughout the world. So if we are going to succeed and successfully live out our lives so that our children and our great children can have a life to live, we're going to have to pay more attention to that in which what we're actually doing to Mother Earth. Because if we don't, us in this lifetime could see those very people that had an opportunity to engage into other affairs pertaining to their livelihoods, or pertaining to that in which what they felt like was pleasurable to deal with. We are going to see those things ultimately change before it is too late. We want to thank you for allowing for us to be a part of your lives during 2020 in regards towards. Thanks again, and shalom, and good luck to all of us.